There's been a lot of justice reform efforts. There's a lot of agreement that mass incarceration has not really been an effective policy and in any event isn't sustainable given our current economic crisis. So there's been a lot of interest across the country in trying to safely unwind mass incarceration without compromising public safety. And that's one of the reasons that we've seen such an uptick in interest in risk assessment algorithms, finding ways to do things better, faster, more, et cetera. So, and the reason really is because if you want to identify people who are going to be safe for release to the community or safe to stay in the community before they're ever incarcerated in the first place. But as we saw in Sharad's presentation, controversy has sprung up around these practices and reform efforts. So you saw the title briefly for the ProPublica article, which came out about a year ago, last March, and got a tremendous amount of dissemination and press. So the report was titled Machine Bias, which says it all. And in case you didn't get that, you can go on to the subtitle, which reads, "There's software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against blacks." There are some problems with that title. The first problem is that risk assessment is not, algorithms is not risk assessment. There are many, many different approaches that are used in different places across the country. Also, the analyses that ostensibly support that conclusion have been roundly criticized. But the report has been distributed to all kinds of practitioners who are wary about risk assessment at this point. And you've seen previews of the fact that some of them are just arguing that risk assessment should be rejected altogether. We're not going to resolve those sorts of arguments today, but it's really where most of the heat is focused around risk assessment AI algorithms in the justice system. So I have a few questions in this domain for the panelists. The first, and again, we had a preview of this from the presentations. The first is that we can define fairness and bias and discrimination in very different ways. So there's predictive fairness, there's disparate impact, there's calibration, there are many different definitions. So the first question is whether there are specific definitions that the panelists would use that would largely view the risk of AI, that would largely view risk assessment or AI as unfair or biased or discriminatory, and whether there are alternative definitions where that wouldn't be the case, where these could be viewed as largely fair, unbiased, or not discriminatory. Anyone?
I guess I'll start. I think one of the things you always have to take into account is what is your baseline and what are you trying to measure. And one of the things that I think the ProPublica article raised was the lack of transparency. So if you have an instrument that you don't know what's in it, all you know is the outcome from it, you don't know what the individual factors are for that offender, if we're talking at sentencing, I think that can raise some serious concerns about fairness and things like that. So I don't think it argues against having risk assessment. What I think it argues is how do you do it? And I think there's a lot to be said about the need for transparency, the need to test at both an individual and an aggregate level what you have, and then thoughts about how you use that information. And at least as we've been working in Pennsylvania, that's really been at the core of our efforts to try to be transparent, but also to try to address issues that come up about fairness, about what factors are fair to use and what factors or what's a fair way of trying to use the information you have.
Others?
Yeah, I can add some comments. So I think broadly there are two classes of definitions of fairness here. One is one that seeks to reduce disparities. So these disparities could be, for example, in detention rates, they can be disparities in error rates, they can be disparities in many different senses. And the other class of definitions is an equal treatment version where we estimate everybody's risk to the best that we can, and then we apply a single threshold and we say we will detain people if and only if they're above a certain threshold. Now, the key problem here is that these two classes of definitions are at odds with one another, And why is that? If I apply the same threshold to two different groups that are different in a variety of dimensions, then those disparities will naturally appear. And so I think much of the debate, and this goes to the ProPublica, is focusing on these disparities without fully appreciating that it is at odds with this other definition. And I would argue that the other definition, the second one of applying a uniform threshold to all individuals, is one that's largely consistent with the way we think of legal fairness. And I would also say it's the one that many people intuitively think of as a fair definition, applying the same standard regardless of one's race. But the issue is that these two notions of fairness are at odds with one another.
Thank you. Any others?
I'll just add something short. Other people have made the comment that, are we seeing more? Are there more problems happening? Or are we just observing them more? And I think that part of the rise in AI is predicated on the rise of data collection mechanisms, and therefore the ability to observe phenomenon at a granular level that wasn't available before, which doesn't say necessarily what was before was right or wrong or good or bad. And I think that to anthropomorphize the risk assessment entirely as a machine is also a mistake, because a person will be involved in evaluating the machine and in being trained to use the machine, and they have responsibilities as well. And so I think it's important to keep a bit broader context than assuming that there's a machine flipping coins that's going to determine people's fate. Hopefully we're not there yet.
If I could just follow up. One other thing, at least in Pennsylvania, we have sentencing guidelines. So the starting point for judges to make a decision, these are advisory guidelines, but the starting point for a judge to make a decision and recommendations about punishment are linked to conviction offense and prior conviction. So that's part of our baseline of information. The question is, if you're going to add risk assessment at sentencing, what value does it add and how do you add it? And I think there are concerns about using risk and aggregate risk score as a means of imposing further punishment, but that doesn't mean that cannot try to identify cases where you should get more information so the court knows more about that individual offender to make a more informed decision at sentencing. And I think those are some important characteristics you have to keep in mind.
Thank you. So I think you've all pointed to the next question that I have for you, which is really considering the use of algorithms compared to what? It's the policy questions that this raises. So it's not necessarily just looking at whether an algorithm is biased in an absolute sense in the abstract, but also really comparing it to whatever practices it's meant to inform, to supplement, rarely to replace, but it's more to inform or supplement. So again, the question is use of AI compared to what existing sentencing or sanctioning approach. So whether, and we don't know the answer to this question, whether the use of risk assessment, for example, in these decisions will exacerbate or mitigate or have no effect on existing disparities in incarceration. So we already are in a place where young black men is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a young white man. And the question is whether the introduction of some of these technologies is going to affect that, and if so, how? And there is some evidence from other domains that when we structure decision-making, sometimes that actually can reduce human biases. So the question for you is what kind of, and you've spoken to this to some extent, but what existing practices would be supplemented or changed with the use of AI, and what can you imagine as positive and negative effects with respect to that?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think what we found in developing our instrument was when we provided example cases to judges to have them talk about risk of reoffense, they almost in every case assumed a higher risk of reoffense than the model that we developed found. And so I think to some degree there's a benefit of having advisory information, having some objective actuarial information for courts to consider, because at least in our experience, it has been used to sort of tamp down this concern about high risk and about excessive sentences and things like that. So I think there is some benefit of bringing that objectivity to consideration that otherwise is just a clinical decision by a court.
So in the policing context, I mean, we can think about these as risk assessments of either little segments of streets or of people. So we tested this in both cases. We asked somebody to circle where the crime they thought was going to be, and then we had the computer do it. There was not that big a difference. When we run the best algorithms, again, we get about 11% better. With the people, we'd show the list to the district commander who said, yeah, I know these guys, they're terrible. And every once in a while they'd say, oh yeah, I don't really know him, oh, he must be new. But whether or not that's true, and we had them write out a list if they would be the same, we don't really know. But the question is, what do they do with that information, right? And so I think what you're saying, what you said about doing things that are positive with that information are better. So let's say we find out someone's really high risk, let's offer them treatment. That's one way of thinking about this false positive rate, right? So it's not punitive and it's helpful. However, I think if you went to talk to those people, I don't think any of them would think that the treatment was not punitive. In this case, in Chicago, they went to their houses and said, you've been identified as being a really high risk for being a homicide victim. So I can imagine if I got that knock on my door, perhaps I would start carrying my gun more. I don't know. We don't know. Well, we were really worried that we would actually see a backfire effect. So we tested that pretty rigorously. But I think I tend to see the negative before I see the positive use. And so I think we should need to be very, very cautious. And when we introduce these tools into practice, they should be tested in a laboratory first. They should be validated, and they should be rolled out in very small pilots under a lot of scrutiny before we sort of adopt them system-wide, and that's not been happening in my experience.
And as a follow-up, are you more concerned about the algorithm in this case, or about how it's applied?
Well, so the algorithm was terrible. Because these are really hard things to predict. If you're trying to predict who's going to be shot, it's really tough. And if we're looking at a social network analysis, the problem is only 2% of shootings are cleared. So we only know who did 2% of them. With homicides, it's 20% in Chicago, which is just mind-boggling. So our predictions are based on just terrible data of all the people that they identified as being high risk. Sure, out of the entire city of Chicago, they did a great job at identifying a high-risk pool. But out of that high-risk pool, only 2 of them were involved in shootings. So we treated 400 people for 2 that really needed the treatment. And our treatment was terrible. So I think we have problems on both sides right now.
So especially where you have such a high false positive rate, all of these problems are exacerbated. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just going to make 2 points about the organizations involved in these things, because they're full of people, even though we're talking about the machine as if it were a member of a team or something. And those organizations adjudicate arbitrary issues through policy and through the judicial system in some cases. And how the machine gets used throughout requires an education of all of those people. And then also that implies the need for a broad notion of like literacy, like data literacy, analytical literacy, to be able to have even these reasoned conversations about the trade-offs of data collection versus algorithm development versus application versus field testing. I feel like what we see are a bunch of examples and we're reacting to them. And some of them have been very good, some have been very bad, some very ugly. But I think that the organizations full of people are a very important context with which to evaluate the role of automation in things that involve social issues especially.
So on that note, knowing what you know now, and with the predictions that you've made into the future, what advice would you provide to policymakers or frontline people in how to make their use of the machine or the algorithm most effective?
Well, go slow and engage a lot of people. We had a lot of feedback early on in our process about the specific factors we're using and how we would implement the instrument. And we've made a lot of changes along the way because of that. Some of the changes we wouldn't have wanted to make, but we did because we appreciate that the courts have to adopt this and embrace this to use it effectively. And if you don't have buy-in from the start or a sense that this is a fair and safe process, it's just not going to work. So from our point of view, go slow and be very transparent. And there's going to be some people that are just against it all the time, and nothing you can do can change it. But you have an obligation, at least I do as a state agency, to try to make sure we're explaining what we're doing and buying people into the process.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is there's this push right now to use these black box machine learning algorithms. We hear a lot about them. There's this implicit implication that we're using these black box algorithms. The benefit is that they're going to be more accurate, that they're going to be more fair. Now, what's interesting is that when we've looked at this issue, we find that very simple, interpretable algorithms perform on par with state-of-the-art black box methods. And so this choice in many ways is false. And so I would encourage policymakers who are looking at these issues not simply to take the state-of-the-art ML method, which there's some temptation, I think, to use, but to really consider carefully what the nature of the algorithm is and if there is any cost to using the simple method, because many times we just see its pure benefit.
And if you haven't seen them, Sharad has beautiful work around this idea of simple rules. So really having simple, transparent, readily visible and challengeable criteria for police stops or for other types of decisions.
So I would say don't. That's my advice to policymakers. I'm just kidding.
You're killing me.
Spend a lot more time developing it, and I don't know if this is the right audience to talk about this, but the amount of time and money and effort that we're spending in creating these models and advancing the data science, spend it on programming and what you do with that model, because an 11% better prediction, that's great. I mean, that's actually very, very good and could result in a big drop in crime if we had any idea what to do with it. But nobody is putting that effort on the practice side.
Yeah. I'd like to disagree with most of these things, just so we have a little bit of contrast. I think that in terms of fast versus slow, we have a lot of examples in the medical world about A/B testing with very serious moral issues that have worked out methods for evaluating drug effectiveness. And there's lots of models that have been developed for cohort-based analysis that let you assess the viability of something in small stages with transparency and other criteria that I think you would approve of. I think for rule-based things, we've seen that now machine learning is saying if the machines learn the rules, it does better if you can specify the task. These tasks are very complicated and they're often human-generated, so maybe the task is the problem, or some dual way of approaching it, both with rules and also with inferred rules. We have systems often that compare each other and one does interpretability. And I think I totally agree with the programming point, that the context in which these things are used is super important to know their implications. And I think that hammering again on the need for diversity and literacy around the creation of algorithms, the collection of data, the application and testing, if we don't have those things, then we're kind of flying blind. And that's not good for anybody.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to put, I can't help myself, I'm going to put in an unintended plug. So this is a follow-up to Jessica's comment. We have really great diverse perspectives here, and it's not algorithms in one context, but I just want to underscore that to what end is a really important thing to consider. So what is the policymaker, the agency, the company, what are they going to do differently as a result of the algorithm or the score? And at least in the context of criminal justice, we have pretty good evidence that you should focus the most intensive services and supervision on the highest risk cases. And this is an important writer, if there are appropriate services in place, then it can be helpful to identify high-risk people. Although, again, we get back to the fact that they may not be very welcoming of those services. So there are issues to work out. I think that we've gotten to one of the questions from the audience. I think we are out of time. Time is up. So we will end there. Thank you very much to the panelists and to you.